Teacher ignores girl in class, shocked to learn her mother's legacy. Imagine being ignored, overlooked, and underestimated just because of where you come from. What if one day the person who dismissed you found out your hidden legacy and realized they had made a huge mistake? This is the story of a young girl who was judged unfairly by her teacher until the teacher discovered the shocking truth about the girl's family. A twist of fate that would forever change the dynamics in their relationship, reminding everyone that no one should be judged based on their circumstances. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in a well-maintained suburban high school. The building, with its tall brick walls and wide glass windows, stood as a quiet testament to years of academic tradition. The halls were bustling with students hurrying between classes, their voices echoing against the lockers, some laughing, others discussing assignments, but all moving with a sense of anticipation for the day ahead. In one of the classrooms on the second floor, Mrs. Thompson stood in front of her students, preparing for the next lesson. She was in her early 40s, a teacher who had been at the school for over a decade. Known for her strict discipline and traditional approach, Mrs. Thompson was a well-respected figure in the school. She held a reputation for excellence and had high expectations of her students, especially in her English literature class, which was one of the most prestigious in the school. Sitting quietly in the back of the room was Emma, a quiet 16-year-old girl with long brown hair and soft eyes. Emma was often overlooked, a shy student who didn't stand out in the way others did. She wore simple clothes, never flaunting the latest trends like many of her classmates. Emma's world was one of books and daydreams, where she found solace in the things that sometimes made her feel invisible. Her father had passed away when she was young, and her mother, though a kind woman, had always struggled to make ends meet. Every day Emma entered Mrs. Thompson's class, hoping for a chance to be seen, to show her teacher that she was capable, just like everyone else. But Mrs. Thompson, too busy with her assumptions about Emma's background, never gave her a second thought. The teacher often looked past Emma, favoring the louder, more confident students who seemed to have all the answers. Emma's hand would often rise in the air, but more often than not, Mrs. Thompson would ignore her, focusing instead on the students she deemed more deserving of attention. As the weeks passed, Emma's frustration grew. She had always been an avid reader and loved literature, but the constant dismissals in class left her feeling small and invisible. She had tried to speak up during class discussions, but Mrs. Thompson seemed to think that Emma's quiet demeanor was a sign of disinterest or lack of intellect. Emma began to wonder if she would ever be able to show her teacher what she was truly capable of. The other students in the class had begun to notice the way Mrs. Thompson treated Emma. Whispers circulated between the students, and some even joked about how Emma was always the last one to be called on, if she was called on at all. It was as though the teacher had made up her mind about Emma from the very start, labeling her as just another quiet, unremarkable student. One day, during a lesson on Shakespeare's Macbeth, Mrs. Thompson asked the class a question about the symbolism in the play. Emma, with her deep understanding of the text, raised her hand high, eager to share her thoughts. But once again, Mrs. Thompson's eyes passed over Emma, landing instead on a more outspoken student who had already spoken earlier in the lesson. "Sarah," Mrs. Thompson called, ignoring Emma once again. "Can you explain the significance of the blood imagery in Macbeth?" Emma's hand slowly dropped back to her desk. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, feeling the familiar sting of being ignored. She had worked hard to understand the play's symbolism and was eager to contribute, but once again, it seemed like she was invisible to her teacher. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's sense of invisibility in Mrs. Thompson's class only deepened. The final exam was approaching, and Emma was determined to do well, to show that she could excel despite the lack of attention from her teacher. She spent late nights reading and studying, preparing herself for the moment when she would finally be able to prove herself. One day after class, Emma's classmate Sarah, who had always been confident and outspoken, leaned over to her and whispered, "Mrs. Thompson was talking to some of the teachers today. I overheard her saying that you're not the brightest student. She's just waiting for you to fail the exam." Emma's heart sank. She couldn't believe her ears. It felt as though her worst fears had been confirmed. Mrs. Thompson, the teacher she had admired for so long, had already written her off. It was then that Emma decided that she wouldn't let this judgment stand. She would prove that she was capable, no matter what Mrs. Thompson thought. The day of the final exam arrived, and Emma walked into the classroom with a sense of quiet determination. She sat down at her desk, clutching her pen tightly, ready to show her teacher that she wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the room. She had studied harder than anyone else, and she was going to give it her all. As the exam began, Emma's mind raced through the questions, pulling from the deep knowledge she had gained from her countless hours of reading. She could feel the weight of the injustice she had suffered, but she pushed it aside, focusing solely on the test before her. When the bell rang to signal the end of the exam, Emma knew she had given it everything she had. A week later, Mrs. Thompson stood in front of the class preparing to announce the final exam results. She looked out at the students with her usual air of authority. When she came to Emma's name, she paused, surprised. There it was, at the top of the list. Emma had scored the highest in the class. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. She quickly skimmed the exam papers again, wondering if there had been some mistake. But no, it was true. Emma had outperformed even the brightest students in the class, all despite being ignored and dismissed by her teacher. The next day, Mrs. Thompson asked to speak with Emma after class. She called her to the front of the room, her voice softening with an unexpected humility. "Emma," she began, "I want to apologize for the way I've treated you. I never took the time to understand who you are or what you were capable of, but after seeing your exam results, I now realize how wrong I was. You've shown me something I failed to see before, your true potential. I'm sorry for not giving you the attention you deserved." Emma, who had long held on to the hurt from the countless times she'd been ignored, smiled faintly. "It's okay," she replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I just want you to see me for who I really am." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. She had learned a valuable lesson that day, that a student's worth is not determined by how loud they are or how much attention they demand, but by the quiet strength they possess. As the school year continued, Emma's relationship with Mrs. Thompson began to change. The teacher no longer overlooked her. In fact, Mrs. Thompson began to actively seek out Emma's thoughts during class discussions, acknowledging her knowledge and insights. Emma's hard work and dedication had not only earned her the highest grade, but had also earned her the respect she deserved. In the following weeks, Emma's story spread throughout the school. Many of the students who had previously dismissed her as quiet and unremarkable began to see her in a new light. They realized that the quietest person in the room could also be the most intelligent and capable. Emma had broken through the barriers of assumptions, showing everyone that their perceptions could be wrong. In life, we often make judgments based on what we see on the surface. We judge people by their appearance, by their demeanor, or by their social status. But true worth is not determined by these external factors. It's found in one's abilities, one's character, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. Emma's story is a reminder that we should never underestimate others, especially those who seem quiet or unassuming. Everyone has a story, a past, and a future that holds untold potential. And sometimes it takes a moment of humility to realize that the person we've ignored might just be the one who teaches us the most valuable lesson. Never judge someone based on assumptions. Everyone has a story, and real worth is often hidden beneath the surface.